Good afternoon to everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satka. I'm an academic at Wits University, leading a project called Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene. I'm also an activist and co-founder of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Today, we've decided to host this webinar to look at the most recent climate science that has come out of the IPCC process, and to really create a learning platform for progressive civil society and those committed to a climate justice future for South Africa. Now, the alarm bell being raised loud in climate science is not new. In 2018, at least in the formal IPCC process, we've had the 1.5 degrees Celsius report. As soon as that report came out, the Climate Justice Charter process, including the Food Sovereignty Campaign, sent a letter to the South African president and to Parliament and asked for an emergency sitting of Parliament in 2018 to assess this report and its implications for South Africa's climate policy. Of course, we were ignored. In the course of 2019, we developed the Climate Justice Charter. And last year in October 2020, we handed over the Climate Justice Charter together with a climate science future document prepared by the Global Change Institute and a memorandum from communities. We demanded urgent action. The climate science document that we handed over, prepared by Francois and others, said that we are heating at twice the global average. Again, we've been ignored. And now we have this sixth cycle of reporting, and we have this report on the physical science basis of climate, confirming that we are now living in a world of permanent weather extremes and other climate challenges. So in this context, we're really creating this platform for you, yes, to learn about the science, but also to support the building of a mass-based climate justice charter movement. And we're hoping that today you will also pledge your own commitment to that struggle. We are returning to Parliament in October to demand an assessment from Parliament, or rather a report from Parliament, on where they are with taking climate science seriously, as well as the charter. And so we look forward to your support in that journey. As part of that journey is to have these kinds of platforms. And so we are really privileged to have with us a close ally of the Climate Justice Charter movement, Professor Francois Engelbrecht. Professor Francois Engelbrecht is based at the Global Change Institute. He's one of the leading climate modelers and scientists in the country. And he has also worked with the International Panel on Climate Change. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Engelbrecht to walk us through his presentation so that we can all, pose questions, ask questions, etc. We have activists from the continent, from various climate justice networks, Woman being one of them, and many, many others. So let's get on with it. Over to you, Francois.
Good afternoon, Vish. Many thanks to yourself and Jane for this invitation. Afternoon, colleagues, to everybody across the country and the region. Let me just share my screen. And then I'll be most happy to take you through some of the key findings of the report. So over the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of participating with a large group of scientists. We were 254 all in all, from 65 countries, towards completing this first component of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This report deals with the physical science base of climate change. And in January or in February next year, you can expect the release of the Working Group 2 report, which will deal specifically with climate change impacts. And then deeper into 2022, the Working Group 3 report will also be released, which is very much about the details of the climate change mitigation effort. So if you followed the news last week, you you certainly would have seen the headlines. As Vish also has just mentioned, the report has been received and communicated extensively as a code red for humanity. And some of the findings being reported is that Earth is warming faster than previously thought, and that the window is closing to avoid catastrophic outcomes. To what extent are these headlines that you've seen indeed underwritten by the science of the report? I'm going to talk about that over the next several minutes. Of course, we've all seen also over the last several weeks weather events that are completely unprecedented in the historical record. Just think, for example, about the heat wave in British Columbia at the end of June, the flooding in Germany, the mega fires that we are currently seeing in the Mediterranean, but also at the same time in California, a year ago or so in Australia. So I think we are all very much aware of the fact that extreme weather events are occurring across the world. What about our own region? I'm going to also talk about that. So in this talk, the scientists have now written the report. It's available online. Of course, everybody now has access to the report. The entire focus of this effort now shifts, of course, to communication. The big question is whether awareness will lead to action. I think I've clearly had frustration and vicious voice about climate change action in South Africa, uptake of the science in South Africa. Of course, globally, the big test now is COP26, the 26th conference of the parties. This report is to a large extent written, as all IPCC reports are, for the parties that form the IPCC. Those are the same 195 plus countries that are also signatories of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So what is going to happen in November at COP26? I hope we will have some time to talk about that as well. And then I'm going to cover 4 aspects in this talk. I'm going to talk about what the 6th assessment report says about future global warming, and specifically then the dangerous temperature thresholds of global warming. How close are we towards crossing those? From that point onwards, I'll talk about regional patterns of climate change, focusing on the Southern African region and Africa. I'll speak about extreme events in a warmer world. And finally, I'd like to identify what the Global Change Institute has assessed as 4 main and immediate climate risks that South Africa, and I should also say Southern Africa, face. So let me start by giving you an overview of this report that is so rich in its science and its findings. I'll start with this first slide, which shows projected changes in global temperature, the global surface temperature, in degrees Celsius on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you can see time. Now the lines there are different colors, they represent different climate change mitigation scenarios. If we start at the top part of the graph, that dark red line, it's referred to in the report as shared socio-economic pathway 8.5. Effectively, that represents a fossil fuel future. And that's the type of future where we really do not make any substantial changes in how we generate energy on the planet. And you can see that towards the end of the century, relative to pre-industrial conditions, and the projections are for the global temperature increase to approach 5 degrees Celsius, a global warming of about 5 degrees Celsius. And then there at the lower end of the graph, you can see 2 very high mitigation scenarios. So SSP 1.9, that is very much the type of scenario at which we still stand a chance of restricting global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can think of those two scenarios at the bottom as Paris Agreement type futures. Now, the report has assessed a wide range of climate change projections from different climate models and different statistical methods. It also looked at a rate of global warming over the last several decades to constrain these model projections. And the final assessment in the report, and perhaps one of the most startling assessments of the report, is that it is now more likely than not, even with our best mitigation effort, that we will exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And we will exceed that threshold as early as the early 2030s. So what do I mean with the best possible mitigation effort? Well, that is that future where firstly, we achieve net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. But of course, those reductions need to happen extremely quickly to avoid the 1.5 degree threshold of being exceeded. So the best effort mitigation also means cutting emissions immediately. That means in the 2020s. And present day levels of emissions need to be cut by about half by 2030. If we do that, and we reach net zero emissions by 2050, then we still stand a chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the chances are in fact greater than 50% that we will be unsuccessful, even with that best possible mitigation effort. The good news is, with those lower two mitigation scenarios you can see in terms of future global warming, indeed, the chances remain excellent that we will be able to restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Why these thresholds of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius? I think most people in this audience will know, of course, that those thresholds define dangerous climate change. So as I will show later in this discussion, above 1.5 degrees Celsius and then above 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, we expect substantial increases in extreme weather events. So we say those levels of global warming define dangerous climate change. They also define irreversible climate change. So above 1.5 degrees Celsius, there exists the possibility that we will initiate the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet, possibly also the irreversible melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And that, of course, commits us to very harmful sea level rise in our own lifetimes. But it also commits future generations to catastrophic sea level rise in the order of 12 meters. So for us, it is in the order of a meter. Should we trigger the irreversible melting of these ice sheets at those levels of global warming during the course of the 21st century. So something to today's children will have to deal with. But we can also get back to dangerous climate change and irreversible climate change in our discussion today. In the report, you'll find a wealth of information in terms of global climate change. Let me just share with you briefly some of the results. Top left graphic is what I've just been speaking about. Top right graphic, changes in the global precipitation across the world's land surfaces. And you can see that for most parts of the world, rainfall is projected to increase in a warmer world. And very soon I will show to you that the Southern African region is in fact one of the few exceptions globally in that regard. And I'll explain to you why that makes us so vulnerable in terms of future climate change. But generally, of course, a warmer world, a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, and there are general increases in rainfall that are projected for the world's continents. Top left, we are heading towards ice-free Arctic. So a tremendous change we are making towards in the Earth system. And you can see that for all practical purposes, the projections are that the Arctic will approach ice-free state around about mid-century. And then top right, if we follow those two high mitigation pathways, we may be able to restrict sea level rise to about 0.5 meter by the end of the century. The lower mitigation scenarios will likely commit us to sea level rise in the order of 1 meter. Now that will of course physically displace hundreds of millions of people without even thinking about the impacts of stronger swells and wind waves and intense tropical cyclones, for example, in a world with higher sea levels. What the report also cannot rule out is the possibility of our understanding of specifically the dynamics of the West Antarctic ice sheet not being adequate at the moment. So the report does not rule out that dotted line you can see there, which is representative of 2 meters of sea level rise in the course of the 21st century. That is regarded as a low likelihood possibility, but it's possible. That 1 meter of sea level rise is a likely outcome for the case of a low mitigation future. So let's start to talk about regional climate change. In the report, you'll find a great deal of analysis, starting with these global types of maps and then working towards regional change. These specific graphs you are looking at there shows, for example, regional patterns of warming at the top left map, when the world itself has warmed by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the other maps are similar. You can see they represent regional patterns of temperature increase for 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. Now, if you just look at that 1.5 degrees Celsius map for a start, as I've just mentioned, we are likely to reach that world. And I don't mean that's an achievement, of course, reaching that world. But we are currently steaming towards reaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold in the early 2030s. And now you can see that some parts of the world are projected to warm faster than others. We are, in fact, of the inhabited southern hemisphere continents, the southern African region is in fact the region that is warming the fastest. The fastest rate of warming in the entire planet is found in the Arctic, as many of you will know. There are many reasons for that. One reason is, of course, because of the loss of ice cover. For example, less and less sea ice above the Arctic Ocean means more and more sunlight can warm the ocean, and less sunlight are being reflected back to space. So that's one important reason why the Arctic is warming so fast. But of course, if you then follow the maps across different levels of global warming, you can see that if the mitigation effort fails, and we are reaching levels of 3 and 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, then it is not an exaggeration to say that the Southern African region will be far less inhabitable than it is today, because of the fact that temperatures in this region are warming at about twice the global rate of warming. But I'll get back to that. Now, this is an extremely important result. It shows changes in global precipitation. Remember, I've showed you that graph showing that summarized across all the continents, precipitation will increase in a warmer world. Now that happens, of course, in the first place over the high latitude continents of the Northern Hemisphere. They are projected to become generally wetter. That change brings with it the risk, of course, of more extreme precipitation events. And flooding in Germany is an example of the type of event that will occur more frequently in a wetter Northern Hemisphere. But it's a completely different type of change than what you can see is projected for the southern African region. So the subtropical parts of the world, including southern Africa, are projected to become generally drier. And that is where our climate change narrative into the future diverges substantially from that of the Northern Hemisphere. If you are living in a country such as Canada or Norway or Sweden, countries that are naturally cool and wet, and now those countries become warmer and somewhat wetter, there are in fact many options available in terms of adaptation. There are even opportunities in terms of agriculture becoming more viable as temperatures are increasing in some of these far northern hemisphere countries. But for those living in the southern hemisphere regions of the world, I mean the subtropical parts of the world, these regions are naturally not cool and wet, they are naturally warm and dry. And now they are projected to become substantially hotter or warmer, as we've seen in the previous slide, and as we are seeing here, likely also substantially drier. And such a change offers very, very few options for adaptation. So what is driving these changes? Just for your interest, the report, of course, goes into great depths in explaining why models are projecting certain changes in temperature and rainfall, and understanding why these changes are occurring and will likely strengthen into the future, of course, helps with having confidence in the projections. Now, one of the best documented changes of climate change that we can see at the moment already across the world in terms of weather patterns or circulation patterns is the southward displacement of frontal weather systems in the southern hemisphere. So the blue colors on that slide, they represent parts of the world where the westerly winds are decreasing. So south of South Africa, we have this zone or this band of westerly winds that are always blowing around the South Pole. We call them the circumpolar westerlies. And within those westerly winds, we find the cold fronts that bring South Africa's winter rainfall. Now, where you see the blue shades, those are the regions of the world where tropical, where these frontal systems and where the westerly winds are projected to weaken in a changing climate. And that's because in a warmer world, these frontal systems are being shifted towards the South Pole. So you can see how the westerly wind component is projected to become stronger around the South Pole. Now today, as we are meeting, these frontal systems are already following tracks about 200 kilometers further to the south than where they are supposed to be because of climate change that has already occurred. And for as long as the world will continue to warm, that southward displacement of the frontal systems will continue. And of course, that will be having further substantial impacts on southern Africa in terms of our winter rainfall, also in terms of southeastern Australia, where that loss of frontal rainfall and generally dry conditions combined with higher temperatures is of course a main driver of the Australian bushfires occurring more frequently. So that was a bit of a background of global changes that you'll find in the report. I think we've touched on a few key findings for our region just to set the table. What about extreme weather events? Well, the summary for policymakers of the report deals with that extensively, and it's underpinned by an entire chapter that is just focused on studying extremes. A key finding is that every additional increment of global warming is important in terms of future increases in extreme weather events. We may say that every bit of global warming matters. So already across the world, the report documents extensive evidence that we can already see, as I think we all can see with our own eyes nowadays, substantial increases in hot extremes, including heat waves that have already occurred, that can already be statistically detected across the planet. Changes are occurring in heavy precipitation events in many parts of the world, including the eastern part of our region. Of course, specifically over the high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere continents. And in many parts of the world, including Southern Africa, we can already detect increases in drought. Now, all these changes are projected to amplify as the level of global warming increases. I hope you've seen that in those maps I've shown of temperature change and precipitation change as a function of the level of global warming. The same is true for extremes. The same patterns are always present, but they amplify with every half a degree of global warming, as we've measured it in the report. And then the bottom bullet there on the slide is, of course, very important also for our own region. We can already detect an increase in the number of category 4 and 5 tropical cyclones, so the intense tropical cyclones. And in a warmer world, these systems have more energy available at the surface of the ocean from which to grow. The warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So the report is also quite clear that storm systems in general, but of course, including the most devastating of all storm systems, namely tropical cyclones or hurricanes. These storms are, the intense types of tropical cyclones are projected to occur more frequently in a warmer world, and tropical cyclones in general are projected to bring more and more rainfall compared to the tropical cyclones of the past, simply because these systems can carry more moisture than in the past. So what does the report conclude formally about Southern Africa? So the report, the IPCC regions, it's interesting how they are defined, but they break Southern Africa up in a western part and an eastern part. The western part is basically everywhere from Mangaung westwards. The eastern part is effectively the wetter part of the region. But you can see that the report already reports, in terms of changes detected already, a decrease in the mean precipitation, an increase in the occurrence of drought. And then the report proceeds and it projects substantial increases in that dryness already at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And that just increases as the level of global warming increases. Of course, the report also extensively document the high rate of temperature increase in our region. I haven't even listed it yet. But that fourth bullet is a consequence of generally warmer conditions combined with decreased rainfall. And generally, we're heading towards a regional climate system that is more prone to the occurrence of heat waves and also high fire danger days. For the eastern part of South Africa, there's an additional change to take note of, namely that despite the fact that this region is projected to become generally drier, at the same time, general increases in heavy precipitation and flooding are likely in this part of the world. Now that includes increases in the number of intense tropical cyclones. So, an interpretation of the report that we can make ourselves, and that the Global Change Institute is making for our region, is that we should be very much aware of the fact that our region is already water stressed. I think we all know that. The subtropical parts of the world are naturally warm and dry parts of the world, but now they are projected to become generally drier and drastically warmer. More so, of course, under the low mitigation futures. And that spells danger and that spells risk, because the options for adaptation are greatly limited for this case of warm and dry becoming warmer and drier. Now, in the eastern parts of our country and the Southern African region, we also need to be aware of the risk of more frequently occurring heavy precipitation events. So with all of that said, I would now like to make use of this kind invitation to share with you what the Global Change Institute thinks and has assessed of 4 major climate change risks that we as Southern Africans may have to deal with in the near future. With near future, I mean IPCC defined near future, the next 20 years, 2021 to 2040. All the risks that I'm going to discuss now already exist. So I think the first and biggest climate change risk South Africa faces right now is the possibility of a day zero event in the Gauteng province. Why am I saying this is a risk already? Well, we only have to go back to the big El Niño drought of 2015-16. It was a drought that lasted for about 4 years over most of the eastern and central interior parts of the country, so across much of the summer rainfall region. At the end of that drought, the Vaal Dam's level has dropped to below 25%. That was in September 2016. Now, the problem is, if the Vaal Dam's level falls to below 20%, it can no longer supply Gauteng. Firstly, because of water quality regions. The quality of the water is just not suitable for human consumption any longer when it falls to below 20%. The other important reason is that for engineering regions, it's virtually impossible to pump that water upstream to Johannesburg if the level is below 20%. So already once before, we've come very, very close to a day zero type drought in Gauteng. So that is that's an extremely important event to take note of. What happened and what was the state of the Vaal Dam level by the end of September 2016. Of course, only about half of Gauteng's water comes from the eastern mega dams via the Vaal Dam, but losing half of it is a major compromise to water supply to our industries, to our households in Gauteng. As we all know, it's our economic heartland. That's where we have 25 million South Africans living. And based in our recent events in our own country, we should think extremely carefully and plan very, very closely and ahead of time for the possibility of a major compromise to the Gauteng water supply. Also, if we think about the potential it may hold for social unrest. We see it in cities across the world. If they run out of water, it's a recipe for social unrest. So a major risk. Let me leave it at that for now. Next on the list, these big droughts are, of course, not only affecting the mega dams, they are at the same time affecting agriculture. Now, the Working Group 2 report to be released in February next year will have a fresh look at risks for Southern African agriculture. But 3 years ago, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius assessed that at 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, the collapse of the maize crop and the cattle industry in Southern Africa becomes likely. Maize is the staple food, as we all know. Once again, there are examples. The 2015-16 El Niño drought resulted in Botswana losing 40% of its cattle. In Botswana, 70% of the people still have some dependence on cattle. Now, biophysical risks, specifically the impact of heat waves in the presence of drought on the maize plant in certain stages of its growth, and the effects of heat stress on the physiology of large mammals. That tells us that the risk exists of 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, bringing the potential collapse of both the maize crop and the cattle. Remember, it's the combined working of these droughts that last for 4 years at an end. These droughts, of course, projected to become more frequent in the region, as I've mentioned some slides ago, in combination with heat stress that are bringing these risks. Now, at this point in time, we haven't even thought about or taken into account the socioeconomic impacts. For how many years can farmers remain sustainable on their farms, both subsistence farmers and commercial farmers, if they are faced with a drought that lasts 3 or 4 years long? In my own experience, that is really stretching the limits of financial sustainability of even small commercial farmers, what to say subsistence farmers. And what about the future where one of these droughts strikes, and then there's a short period of rainfall before another one strikes? So what I'm saying is that the IPCC assessment that 3 degrees Celsius of global warming may be that threshold of collapse may in fact be an overestimate or a too lenient estimate. If we take into account the socioeconomics of farming, maybe that tipping point exists even at a lower level of global warming. So more work is needed to understand exactly where the tipping point is. Thirdly, a third main risk, I think we are moving into a future where we can increasingly expect heat waves of unprecedented magnitude occurring in our region. We've seen it now in Canada with the British Columbia heat wave that also affected the northwestern states of the United States of America. Hundreds of people died in that late of June heat wave. In the specific part of British Columbia, the people are not used to this type of heat wave at all, and they don't have air conditioning, and they were extremely vulnerable, especially the elderly. Now, of course, exactly the same risk exists here. Most of our people don't have, of course, comfortable housing with air conditioning, and especially elderly people that are in informal housing when a heat wave strikes, and who don't have their children close by to help them, for example, to get access to cool water. It is literally a life-threatening situation. And I think we are on the brink of observing more and more heat waves in our region, bringing high mortality. And it is such an obvious near-term risk. And for some reason, our adaptation mechanisms are just not in place. Finally, maybe the least likely of the risks I'm highlighting today is the possibility of, as the Americans would call it, a category 4 or 5 hurricane reaching Maputo, or even the Limpopo province, maybe as far south as Richards Bay in South Africa. It has happened before in the recent past that cyclones of this intensity reach our Southern African region. I spoke at the beginning of this talk about unprecedented extreme events occurring worldwide. But of course, tropical cyclone Idai that made landfall on the 14th of March at Beira is an example of an absolutely unprecedented event affecting our own region. Now, in the end, it is estimated that more than 1,300 people died because of the flooding and the storm surge, that wall of seawater coming from the ocean caused by the cyclone. Most of the people died in Beira and in Mozambique, but also later on in the path of the storm in Zimbabwe, mostly due to mudslides, and earlier also because of flooding in Malawi. Everybody, this is the worst flood disaster ever recorded by humans in the historical record in Africa, south of the equator. It's only in the last 2 decades that we see category 3 to 5 hurricanes forming in the Mozambique Channel. This specific tropical cyclone had at category 4 hurricane status just before it made landfall, while it was still over the Mozambique Channel. Now, in a warmer world, it is absolutely possible that such a system can move further to the south and reach Maputo or even northeastern South Africa. Let me point out that this has happened before in the form of weaker cyclones. In fact, there was one this year, tropical cyclone in the east. By the time that it reached the Limpopo province of South Africa, it was no longer a cyclone, it was a tropical low. But the point is they do follow southern trajectories. These are rare events, but it happens. I don't think we are prepared at all if a system with category 4 or 5 hurricane status reach Richards Bay or move into the Limpopo River Valley, and the effects will be absolutely devastating in South Africa in terms of loss of life or in terms of the economy. And the risk is even higher for Maputo. So having said all of that, let me just briefly conclude with 2 slides. Please have a look at the assessment report when you have the time. You may want to start by reading the summary for policymakers, which I think is a wonderful product, a collaboration between the scientists and the 195 governments that are parties to the IPCC. The report also for the first time goes into great lengths to make the underlying data accessible to all. So specifically, there is now a so-called interactive atlas available that disseminates all the data that underpins the report to climate scientists and climate change risk analysts across the world. Maybe make a note of that address I've listed there and the web address of the atlas. And for some colleagues, it may be of value. Of course, the Global Change Institute is always ready to assist in how to make use of a system like this and also how to interpret the maps and the data generated. And then finally, I'd like to say a few points about what happens now in the post-report phase. So the IPCC is an interesting organization. I thought that some of you may be interested to know that it still regards itself formally as a so-called policy neutral organization. So its mandate is to provide policy relevant output to specifically the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations process. So a main purpose of this report, not the only purpose for sure, but the main purpose is to inform the 26th conference of the parties. So at the end of the scientific process of writing the report, the scientists get together with the governments that make up the IPCC, 195 governments in the last case, and over the last months, more or less over the last month and very intensely in the last 2 weeks before the report was released last week. And we as the scientists had these long discussions with the governments, during which we jointly wrote down the key policy relevant messages of the report. And the fact that, you know, these 195 countries with very, very diverse views have happened to agree on that set of points is already a very, very positive step. There's the location where you can find the report and the summary for policymakers if you'd like to read it. Of course, it's a reality that most climate scientists in including myself and the colleagues at the GCI, of course, not as individuals, we are certainly not policy neutral. I think most climate scientists are absolutely convinced that the world must pursue a carbon neutral world, and that immediate reductions in emissions are needed, purely because of the immense consequences that climate science is projecting will increasingly occur if we fail to embark on that mitigation pathway into the future. But still, the main task of scientists remain to raise awareness. We don't really have generally strong decision-making powers, of course. And that's why I always accept an invitation from Vish when it comes through, because our task, maybe our biggest task as climate change scientists, is to communicate the key findings of a report such as this one. Our job certainly includes raising awareness, but will it lead to action? That's, of course, where the agents of change come in, such as the Climate Justice Charter Group, to drive our own country and our own region, and in the end, the world towards action. COP26 is going to be so important. There are some positive rumors going around of a new pact that will include the USA and China, and that will commit the world towards net zero emissions. But others say, of course, that the conference may not have a successful outcome. I think it is going to be fascinating to watch that discussion towards November this year. And with that, everybody, I hope this was a useful interview, and I hope we have some time for discussion. And I'm handing back to our chair, Vish. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Francois. And we're definitely going to deepen collaboration with you and colleagues at GCI. But I think you put out a lot of food for thought. There's been a lot of comments and some questions. The first, I think, to pick up on was from Mark Vecherev. I mean, Mark is basically saying, well, you know, Paris is really not ambitious enough. It seems we need much more than Paris. And so even if we are thinking about a low emission scenario, what is the extra that we need? I know that might be a line you don't want to cross. That's the policy line. But maybe you want to speak to this issue. Over to you, Francois.
Sure.
Do you have any comment?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Fishman, I think all countries of the world will now be tested in terms of their ambition to mitigate as we head towards the 26th conference of the parties in Glasgow. So Paris isn't enough. That's true. It has never been enough in terms of the commitments countries have made to reduce emissions. The question is whether Glasgow is going to be enough. Now, there are talks of a new pact forming. It actually already includes the USA, the European Union, the UK, Japan, and South Korea, that will all commit at this meeting to net zero emissions by 2050 and massive cuts by 2030. So these countries will likely commit to between 40% of their emissions being cut by 2030 already. Now, China has, ahead of the meeting, already made a commitment of net zero emissions by 2060. But exactly what it entails in terms of carbon dioxide versus other greenhouse gases, it's not entirely clear. But what we all hear is, of course, that there is a discussion underway towards getting China to also make a commitment towards net zero emissions by 2050. And then they in the USA and these other main economic powers, of course, also need to agree on a method through which they will monitor one another's progress into the future. So I think there has never been for as long as I've been following the negotiations, there has been such high expectations of a main climate negotiations meeting. all countries must officially, ahead of the meeting, submit their new nationally determined contributions in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. So we will have it very clearly on paper what each country is committing to. So we will very soon know whether the so-called implementation meeting of the Paris Agreement is really going to implement a massive global climate change mitigation effort. We will also see where South Africa is standing when it makes its official submission. All I can say, colleagues, everybody, I think we do expect far stronger emissions. This group of countries I've mentioned, far stronger commitments. This group of countries I've mentioned they control 2/3 of the world's emissions and 2/3 of the world's economy. If they make this change, everybody else will have to form in place very quickly or left behind. Whatever the case may be, I think many countries will start to mitigate far more strongly, and there is likely to be a massive shift towards investment in the renewable sector. And that on its own is going to make a difference. Once again, where is South Africa going to find itself? Is South Africa going to walk this path and possibly share in these investments and cheap loans to make this conversion to a renewable sector? Or is South Africa going to resist and trail the world and all these countries that are going to walk this path of substantial change?
Yeah, and currently South Africa is really consistently contradictory and ambiguous with its commitments to offshore oil and gas and so on. And there was a comment that came up earlier from Pooven from Natural Justice, and we're going to fight that. Samantha asks, can you please explain how the IPCC defines net zero?
Sure, Samantha. So in the case of the IPCC definition, it is very straightforward. It means that from 2050 onwards, when the so-called net zero point is reached, there should be no further net increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. So if anything else is still emitted at that point in time, there should be compensating technologies that remove it again from the atmosphere. Now, at this point in time, so-called carbon dioxide removal technologies do not exist at the scale at which they are needed. So in practical terms, what it means is that the world's energy will have zero dependence on fossil fuels by 2050. Let me point out that the Working Group 3 report to be released I think around about in the middle of next year will, of course, have many pathways towards achieving a net zero emissions world. But effectively, it means that by 2050, the world is no longer getting a fraction of its energy from fossil fuels. It's getting it from alternative sources. It's also, of course, debated what those sources will be. For example, the International Energy Agency, about 6 weeks ago or so, they've put on the table their vision of 2050 net zero emissions. And they said it will be a world where 70% of all energy is generated through renewable sources, mostly solar, wind, and hydropower. And the other 30% in their estimate is nuclear power. Now, I realize that's also controversial, of course. But according to their analysis, the growth in renewable energy will just not be fast enough to replace the fossil fuels. A portion of nuclear energy will still be needed to replace some of those fossil fuel sources of energy.
Okay, thanks for that. And welcome to our colleague from Kenya, from the Food Sovereignty Movement, has joined us. So Arthur asks, I'm thinking about what will be the implications on most fragile health delivery systems when disease patterns change in sub-Saharan Africa, COVID exposed serious vulnerabilities and sheer unpreparedness from policy to mitigation plans in our healthcare systems. This is a very good point. What could the future look like in the event of continuing business as usual? for Southern Africa and Africa, I suppose, Sub-Saharan Africa. Where will we be as Sub-Saharan Africa, Francois, if it's business as usual, if the politics really doesn't kick in and so on?
Yeah, it's a world I'm trying not to imagine, patient colleagues. So impacts will be broad and devastating across all sectors: water, agriculture, biodiversity, and health. So a world that has reached 3 degrees of global warming translates to about 6 degrees Celsius in Southern Africa. It's an uninhabitable world in terms of you can't keep cattle and you won't have a maize crop. That's not the region we've all grown up in. It's something different. It's a different world. Now, multi-year droughts are also starting to occur more often in our region. And multi-year droughts is a key risk that will drive this collapse of the maize crop and the cattle industry. But at the same time, will bring more frequent day zero type droughts to many of the Southern African cities. That risk is very clear in the southern coastal cities that are losing their frontal rainfall first. So specifically, of course, we are all aware of the fact that Cape Town is vulnerable to these day zero type risks. Right now, that risk is already 3 times higher than what it is supposed to be because of climate change that has already occurred. But the risk stretches all along the Cape South Coast, all the way through to East London. So all the cities that are getting a portion of frontal rainfall are vulnerable. And under 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, it's very difficult to think how a city like Cape Town can grow in any way. It needs a new water resource. So what will that resource be? Desalination is probably the most realistic option, but very expensive. Somewhere along the road to 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, we will reach these major tipping points in terms of day zero events, impacting so often on the southern coastal cities and on Johannesburg and the larger Gauteng province, and in fact across the summer rainfall region, that the growth of our cities will no longer be sustainable. In terms of health impacts, I think the most important is the immediate impact of heat on human health and on human mortality. A variety of pests and pathogens are of course also favored by generally higher temperatures. But some of those are also limited by moisture availability. So one needs to look at each of these individually to really generate a map of its projected change. But generally, of course, as subtropical temperatures extend further and further towards the south, the general expectation is a spread in the distribution of many of these diseases and their vectors.
So there's quite a few comments and questions. I want us to deal with some of them, but we are at 5 o'clock. If comrades are happy, we'll stay for a few more minutes, but we'll be a bit more economical with time. So there was a point about heat waves. I think it was Richard who asked that question. If you could unpack that a little bit more, heat waves, and help us understand it better. I think that's the one question. The other relates to climate science and geopolitics. I mean, what are your colleagues saying in places like China and the USA about shifts in climate policy? Scientists in those countries talking to you in the IPCC, and are they hopeful? There was also a very important point about, well, you know, the rich countries have not really committed in the context of the COP process. You know, it was the promise of 100 billion to the Green Fund, but will financing shift? I think this is the big issue to address climate debt, historical climate debt owed to countries of the global south. And then, of course, there is the issue of, does the IPCC have positions on carbon capture, trading, tech solutions, etc., to achieve net zero? from a climate justice perspective, we reject these solutions as false solutions. But it'll be nice to hear from you if the scientific community is talking about them in the IPCC and so on. And then there was a question about, yeah, well, China is really, I mean, it's taking more coal-fired power stations, etc. We know that. And yeah, I mean, South Africa, I mean, the big issue is South Africa. So that's come up in a few of the comments. So how do we really influence South Africa? And I think that's partly got to do with our politics, comrades, and building the movement. Samantha's made the point that we really have to ground ourselves again. I mean, this kind of analysis can be very debilitating, and there is a trend in climate politics towards doom and gloom and catastrophism. But that's not what this analysis should lead us to. There is still room for action. So I think that's a very important point for us to think about. And maybe, Francois, you'd want to say something about how we influence the government. And I think we'll kind of wrap up there. Over to you.
Yes, Vish, sure. So let me just very briefly talk about heat waves, and then we'll get into this bigger discussion. Heat waves are prolonged events of oppressive temperatures. The World Meteorological definition says that if you know what the average temperature of the warmest month of a specific location is, let's say, for example, in Johannesburg, the month of the highest temperature is January, and the average maximum temperature is 29 degrees Celsius. Then a heat wave is an event where the temperature is 5 degrees higher than that value for a period of about 3 days. So it's a prolonged period of temperatures, maximum temperatures that are far above what is normal. Now, the problem with climate change is that it is bringing heat waves of unprecedented magnitude. For example, this British Columbian heat wave that led to the Canadian temperature record being broken, it brought to a place called Lytton in Canada, where the average January temperature is, where the average June temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. A heat wave event where the temperature was for several days above 45 degrees Celsius and eventually reached a value of just a few points of a degree below 50 degrees Celsius. So by far exceeding even the natural definition of what a heat wave is. So that's another important aspect of climate change. It brings events that have no equivalent in the historical record. So planning, for example, based on the historical record also helps nothing in the face of a changing climate. For example, Gauteng has never experienced a drought that lasts for, say, 6 years at an end, bringing the level of the Vaal Dam and the eastern mega dams to below 20%. It hasn't happened before. We've come close, and climate change tells us that risk is just becoming bigger and bigger. So in terms of heat waves specifically, they are becoming unprecedented in amplitude and in duration and in frequency. And their impacts are raw. They usually co-occur with droughts. So they immediately impact on crop yield, they impact on cattle, they impact through heat stress on all big mammals, including humans. So they are an exceptionally dangerous phenomena in a changing climate. Okay, but then let's talk about how to facilitate change in our region. I think we do need to acknowledge that the change that we need is transformative. And it can really only be achieved if it is policy driven. In the European Union, for example, the expectations are that they will have converted the entire transport system to being electric by the late 2030s. Now, just think, for example, what that type of change will mean in South Africa. We have more than 100 1,000 jobs, I've been told, just in the filling stations we have all along South Africa's big roads and highways. That entire technology must be replaced over the next decade or maybe 2 decades. 2 decades with an electric transport infrastructure. We are driving larger distances than in the European Union. It's even more challenging for us, but such a change can really only be facilitated if it's driven by the policy of government, I would say. I can't see it happening in any other way at that scale if it's not policy driven. So the expectation is that this implementation meeting of the Paris Agreement should also, for the first time, materialize at a scale never seen before. The flux of green climate funding, investments, and cheap loans towards the developing countries that are, of course, not in the first place responsible for the global warming problem and the current state of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So I also cannot see how the Paris Agreement can be implemented without this financial support to the developing world to make the transition. I think there are immense opportunities in here. So if we can, for example, as a country, clearly demonstrate that we are doing our fair share in mitigation, then we should really qualify for massive just transition infrastructure investments in South Africa, which is in the first place about systematically removing our coal power plants over a period of 2 to 3 decades and replacing them with massive renewable energy plants funded through investments and cheap loans from the developed countries. Without that type of investment, the developing world will, of course, not be able to make this transition. Yet, for everybody's sake, it is important that the developing world develops with a renewable pathway. Else the costs that developed countries will incur through their own mitigation efforts will in the end be in vain if fossil fuel emissions keep on growing in a developing Africa into the 21st century. So everybody needs everybody. The question is whether the level of ambition is now where it should be to really facilitate change. My prediction is that we will see the strongest climate agreement ever by November, and it may be too late. It's likely to be too late to prevent 1.5 degrees Celsius from occurring. But I think it is going to massively change the investment landscape. Investment may be bigger than ever before in renewable technologies. The future of oil and coal is not a bright future. Investment will substantially shift away. That's my prediction. And to give you the best positive outlook I can, Vish, the report is very clear that we can still, the official IPCC language is, it is extremely likely that we can avoid the 2 degrees Celsius threshold if we now follow that immediate mitigation pathway, deep cuts in the 2020s, net zero by 2050. We can still avoid the worst impacts of dangerous climate change. Probably too late for 1.5 degrees, but we can stay below 2. So there's still a great deal of benefit we can get from a mitigation effort. Let's see what will happen over the next several months.
Okay, I think we've canvassed most of the issues. I mean, some of these issues are ongoing conversations for us. And again, a big thank you to Francois for making his time and to being available. He'll participate in our Climate Science Education Committee. We are getting organized, to work on climate awareness on a public level, and we'll be drawing on Francois, GCI, and others as we go down that route. But in addition, just to update everyone before we wrap up, The Climate Justice Charter movement, as I said, is going back to Parliament in October to call the bluff of our parties, our political leadership in Parliament about their commitment. Their participation in our conference last year was lackluster. Most of these parties didn't display a serious commitment to the climate problem, and it exposed them. And that's why we back in October with this new climate science, together with hopefully all of you part of that moment. The second thing that's happening is that we are developing a climate justice tool for transitions in workplaces, communities, and big institutions. And that will again be part of the climate awareness work we'll be doing in communities. And that's going to come out pretty soon. We'll be launching that. The third thing is a climate justice deal for South Africa, what we are calling the new social contract, the climate justice deal social contract for South Africa. We've been working intensely since last year with various heterodox economists, ecologists, etc., to rethink and critique macroeconomics. The charter calls for us to challenge economics, which is part of the problem. And so we've come a long way. We've had 3 high-level workshops. We are now in a process of synthesizing those documents. We'll be putting out an evidence-based climate justice deal social contract for South Africa in coming months for conversation and deliberation. We'll probably launch the draft parallel to the COP meeting in Glasgow in November, and then, of course, launch it in late January to shape the narrative around the state of the nation and the budget speech that will also be delivered by the Minister of Finance. But in addition to that, we are going to be consciously opening up the Climate Justice Charter movement to membership, and just keep your eye on that space. We'll be building key committees to build capacities in several areas. The bottom line is what Francois gave us at the end. We still have a window to act, and it is this decade. And we've got to put everything into it, the best of who we are into it, to prevent the worst case scenario. And so whatever we do now going forward has to be about that. That is the fundamental issue. And we hope that you join us in this journey. And we hope you endorse the charter. On Sunday, we'll be having a book launch where we'll also be deliberating on these questions. The issue of eco-fascism will be central in that book launch, and I hope many of you attend and come to that book launch on Sunday. I think Jane has shared those details as well, and we'll also pass that on to you. Francois, do you need to say anything else before we wrap up? We'll also be sharing this recording with everybody, resource education work as well. Francois, any final thing from you?
No, Vish, thank you just very much again for the opportunity to share the science with this community, and I'm looking forward to our collaboration into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois, and thank you to Jane, Cherry, and her team at COPAC for convening us, and thank you to all of you for attending and making the time. And we hope this was useful and valuable for your work and your struggles. Take care.